Melissa, may I begin? Just in case, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar launching a special issue of the South African Journal of International Affairs. We have with us today guest editors Lisa Otto and Marcel Nagar. I am Martha Bridgman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the journal, and it's been my great pleasure to work with these two guest editors and the authors to bring to life this very interesting discussion about South Africa's foreign policy 30 years into the democracy that began in 1994. We have the journal issue actually being released as a whole very shortly, but all the papers are online and they have all been, they're either open access or free to view. So we will be posting links to the articles that will enable you to read those at a later stage in the chat box. Just before I introduce the speakers formally, I would like to just mention that we will be having a question and answer period. I see about 80 participants have logged on. We had about 300 registrants, so we'll see. And this session is being recorded and live streamed as well. So if you wish to view it later, it will be on YouTube through the SAIIA channels. The Q&A period will call upon questions that have been posted in the chat box as well as in the Q&A box. So please feel free, as you listen to the papers being presented, feel free to pose your questions, and we will be monitoring that for the discussions at the end of the three presentations today. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. I'll start with Lisa Otto, who is she's giving us a wave. She is an associate professor and the deputy director of the SARChI Chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy at the University of Johannesburg. She holds a C2 NRF rating and acts as co-editor-in-chief of the African Security Review. So it's been interesting to work with another editor in the co-editing of this issue. She holds her doctorate in political studies from UJ and an MA in international peace and security from King's College London. Her current research interests are in the areas of security, diplomacy, and foreign policy. She also writes about South African foreign policy, and you may see her name in wider than the African Security Review and UJ. So we are also welcoming today Dr. Marcel Nagar, who did her doctorate at the University of Johannesburg, also in political science, but is now based at the University of the Western Cape, down in Cape Town, near where I am. And she has the research interests at the moment, focusing on African politics, international political economy, foreign policy, public policy and administration, and the broader debates surrounding the developmental state as well as the democratic developmental state. I'm sure those points also filter through in the papers that we'll be hearing. She is an author, a published author. Her books are The Road to Democratic Development, Statehood in Africa, The Cases of Ethiopia, Mauritius, and Rwanda, came out in 2021. And she co-edited the title Government and Politics with Van Schalk in 2023. Our third panelist, and apologies, the name is not appearing right now, Tinashe, Dr. Tinashe Sithole. For various reasons, his name will be corrected, but he's coming on Dr. Otto's link. He is a postdoctoral research fellow with the SARChI Chair at the University of Johannesburg, the SARChI Chair in African Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. He holds a PhD from UJ, where his doctoral research examined natural resource governance in post-liberation states and comparing South Africa and Zimbabwe. His current research interests are African diplomacy and foreign policy, electoral governance, and the political economy of extractive and critical minerals in Southern Africa. Certainly an important topic for South African foreign policy at this time. He also serves as an associate editor for the Journal of African Elections and is actively engaged in research supervision on the continent. So I welcome the three panelists. I will read out the title of the paper before they present. And then please realize we'll go through all three papers before the Q&A period begins. So again, you are welcome to post questions as they speak, and then we will attempt to address all of those. We've hoped to leave about a half an hour for Q&A. Okay, so beginning with the introduction or editorial for the special issue, which I would just like to mention, it covers a number of major themes within the wider topic of South Africa's foreign policy at this juncture in our history. It also offers normative insights into the future trajectory of South Africa's foreign policy under the 7th administration led by President Cyril Ramaphosa and beyond. Important in those discussions will be consideration of foreign policy under Pretoria's current Government of National Unity, or GNU, as we call it here. I will turn over now to Lisa. Dr. Otto will be addressing South African foreign policy at 30 years, non-alignment in a volatile world. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks very much, Martha, and good afternoon to all our participants. So I just want to take the opportunity to overview the special issue, where it kind of came from, and what it does. So the special issue was an idea born out of a conference that we hosted via the chair a couple of years ago. And in the aftermath of that, we put out a call for papers with really the notion of having a kind of stock-taking exercise for South African foreign policy at this kind of crucial mark of 30 years since 1994, assessing what our foreign policy has come to look like over that period of time, whether those threads that we've kind of identified, quite seminal in Nelson Mandela's stated kind of outlook for South African foreign policy in 1993, whether that was still holding. But then also in the kind of lead up to last year's election, and then certainly in the aftermath of that, you will remember that there were conversations about whether the ANC would continue to hold a majority at the elections. And then we, of course, saw that that was not the case. And certainly we've seen a lot of analysts and pollsters predict that we are now in this period going forward of coalition governance at the national level. And so in the context of that, it provided an interesting opportunity to look at what South African foreign policy is, so kind of that stock-taking element, but also how it might recalibrate. And so the special issue to kind of cover these themes deals with strengths, challenges, lessons, and ways forward in that kind of 1994 to 2024 period, but then also looking forward in terms of foreign policy under the GNU. So rather than treating that kind of 30-year mark as a moment of closure, the issue treats it as a moment of strategic uncertainty where inherited principles and domestic politics and global instability and volatility, which we see ever increasing by the day, intersect. And so the special issue is really anchored in the recognition that South Africa's foreign policy is operating now in a fundamentally altered global order. And in this, of course, we see the erosion of liberal internationalism, the shift towards multipolarity, at least some actors like South Africa seeking that, rising geopolitical tensions, and the weakening of multilateralism and international law. And so the issue doesn't necessarily just ask whether South Africa should return to kind of past foreign policy ideals, such as that human rights element, for example, that many scholars have wondered what became of, but also how it navigates competing normative, strategic, and material pressures in an increasingly fractured international system. And so central theme that we have in the special issue is the increasing salience of the domestic political dynamic in shaping South Africa's external behavior, considering how domestic political change affects foreign policy coherence. And so in this, we're thinking about things like how the GNU brings together parties that have divergent and sometimes competing foreign policy orientations. I think we certainly see this in media statements that emanate from the different parties that form part of the GNU, and how this creates new challenges for signaling consistency and strategy, the kind of public persona of South Africa on the international stage. And so we're treating foreign policy not just as kind of technocratic, kind of insulated from politics, which sometimes it can be, but as something that is increasingly likely to be shaped by coalition governance, internal contestation, and also legitimacy concerns. So we've got three interlinked kind of thematic themes that structure the issue. The first is on evolution and strategic positioning, and this looks at how South Africa's foreign policy has evolved over the last 30 years, and then also the persistence and contestation of certain principles within South Africa's foreign policy, such as non-alignment, such as Pan-Africanism. And then in the second theme, this is peace, security, and African agency. We look at South Africa's role in mediation, peacekeeping, and conflict resolution, predominantly also on the continent, and the extent to which African agency is being asserted in global crises. And then thirdly is domestic politics and external behavior, so how these internal political dynamics shape foreign policy choices and the credibility of the government. So across these three themes, I think there are quite a few interesting findings that come up, and we've got authors that are also looking at interesting and topical events that are playing themselves out on the international stage, such as South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ. And we're finding that South Africa's foreign policy over the past 30 years shows a certain continuity in principles, but inconsistency in the articulation and implementation of those principles. And I think that's certainly something that comes up in the paper that myself and Marcel authored, and which you will speak about shortly. So across the issue, we see that South Africa has showed a sustained commitment to Pan-Africanism, to South-South cooperation, and to multilateralism. But at the same time, these commitments have not always translated into coherent or kind of predictable strategic posture, particularly in the context of this kind of increasing global power competition between those blocks that we've seen traditionally, but now also increasingly reflected also in the strain in the transatlantic relationship. Under peace, security, and African agency, we see that South Africa has exercised meaningful diplomatic and normative influence, particularly in peace and mediation as well as in legal diplomacy, but this influence is often structurally constrained. And so in the issue, we see kind of being documented the role that South Africa has played in mediation, in peace building, in legal fora, and participation in African-led diplomatic initiatives beyond the continent, such as in the case of Ukraine. And these actions have elevated African agency and visibility in global affairs, even where material leverage has been limited. So under the third theme, domestic political dynamics and external behavior, we see that domestic political change has become certainly a determinant of South Africa's foreign policy coherence and credibility as it's being perceived from outside. And so the issue highlights how internal political constraints, coalition governance and tensions within that governance system, within the GNU, shifting legitimacy pressures, are increasingly shaping foreign policy choices, or at least the signaling of those choices. And so the issue therefore also suggests that the challenge is not necessarily that absence of principles, those principles are there, but it is the difficulty of operationalizing them consistently in a context where we have this kind of shifting sands within our domestic political context, as well as a volatile international system. So non-alignment emerges as kind of ideological neutrality not necessarily as ideological neutrality, but as a contested and adaptive strategy, the credibility of which depends on the clarity of purpose around it, as well as of communication of it. And so a key finding here is that the influence should not be measured solely by the immediate outcomes that South Africa is able to achieve. The issue shows that agenda setting, norm articulation, and coalition building, particularly within the Global South, remain important forms of power for South Africa, albeit ones that can provoke geopolitical resistance, as we have seen, certainly with the United States. And so the issue finds that foreign policy is no longer insulated from domestic contestation in the ways that it might have been prior to 2024, but instead South Africa's external behavior increasingly reflects efforts to manage internal political fragmentation, to reaffirm its foreign policy identity, its credibility, and its leadership both domestically and internationally. And so across these themes, we find that the special issue shows South African foreign policy that is ambitious, but also constrained, principled, but uneven, and influential, but ultimately also contested. And so the central challenge facing South African foreign policy at 30 and in the context of a government of national unity is not relevance, but it is alignment. Alignment between principles and practice, between domestic politics and external strategy, and between aspiration and capability. So our foreign policy is neither settled nor exhausted, and the issue suggests, kind of reading between the lines there, that South Africa remains consequential as a middle power, but its future influence depends on recalibrating its strategy, managing political complexity domestically, and navigating an increasingly divided global context with greater clarity and consistency. So this is not offering necessarily a prescription, but it does clarify to a certain degree the choices, constraints, and consequences that South Africa faces in its foreign policy at this moment in time. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. That is to the point, and the contrasting challenges are of interest. I'm sure we'll be discussing that in the question period. We will move to a related paper that both Lisa and Marcel co-authored. This paper focuses on South Africa's non-alignment posture under the GNU, and it asks the question, is South Africa still seeking multipolarity amid great power rivalry? So, Marcel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridgman, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. And before I begin, I'd just like to thank the organizers at SAIIA, and in particular, the editor of the South African Journal of International Affairs, Dr. Bridgman, for the invitation and for convening this timely discussion. Also goes to Professor Otto as the guest editor and my co-author. So today I'll be just briefly discussing the article that myself and Professor Otto co-authored on South Africa's non-alignment. And in thinking about this article, it really came about after the conference that Professor Otto just discussed. And we reflected on this two-day conference, which reviewed South Africa's 30 years of foreign policy, and we made two key observations, just to echo what Prof. Otto has just said. On the one hand, the international system has been radically transformed since 1994, when South Africa did transition into democracy and reintegrate itself back into the international community. So back then, the international system, as we know, was characterized as a unipolar, liberal international order under the leadership of the United States. And so for South Africa at that time, it was pretty easy to navigate through a relatively stable and predictable international climate. It had two choices: either to subscribe and embrace liberal norms and international law, or to risk being excluded yet again. However, now the international system and issues of foreign policy is becoming increasingly complex as the world shifts away from unipolarity towards an emerging multipolar world order. As Prof. Otto has said, we've seen this erosion of international norms and laws and multilateralism. And then our other key observation was significant changes that took place within South Africa's domestic political environment, that being the emergence of a government of national unity following the 2024 general elections. And so this adds an additional layer of complexity, not only to public policy broadly, but also to foreign policy. It introduces a scenario where we have members of the GNU who are not on the same page when it comes to matters of foreign policy or posturing. And this is something that we unpack within this article. So based on these developments, as well as South Africa's position now as this emerging middle power, we reassess its commitment to one of its founding principles, that of non-alignment. And just to briefly note, non-alignment as a concept, it refers to that strategy that was pursued by developing states within the context of the Cold War, whereby it focuses and emphasizes collaboration, cooperation, communication to resolve international disputes, rather than taking a side with any of the major powers at that time. So South Africa and the ANC in particular, it has a long history with non-alignment. It's been a ardent supporter of non-alignment, and we can trace this back to 1955, where it attended the Bandung Conference and the subsequent non-alignment movement meetings. This concept of non-alignment can also be found within its Freedom Charter. And if we look at the period from 1994 up until today, if we assess South Africa's foreign policy, just re-echoing what Prof. Otto has just mentioned, while there has been inconsistencies in the way that it has been communicated, we can clearly say that South Africa has been committed to this concept. And so this has led us to pose two important questions, which we unpack in our article. Firstly, how has South Africa's commitment to non-alignment evolved in response to the shift towards a multipolar world order? And then secondly, to what extent does this policy of non-alignment remain a viable and coherent policy under this post-2024 government of national unity? And so in order to respond to these questions, the article sets out three objectives. Firstly, what we do is we critically analyze this concept of non-alignment, at least at a theoretical level. We unpack it, we see how it serves as a critique to realism, to balance of power theories. And then secondly, what we do is we assess South Africa's application of non-alignment using two contemporary case studies. The first being the Russia-Ukrainian war, and the second one being the Israel-Gaza war. And what we are doing here is we are assessing whether South Africa is indeed sincere in its application of non-alignment within those two contexts. And then finally, what we do is we highlight potential challenges which South Africa may face within this context of the GNU with regards to its foreign policy. So for the sake of time, I'll briefly just touch on some of the key findings which we made. Firstly, within this context of an emerging multipolar world order, we find that this policy of non-alignment is best suited as a diplomatic strategy to small and middle powers such as South Africa. This is because it grants such powers a greater degree of flexibility, rather than having it beholden to either traditional power block, as we see now in the rise of this great power rivalry in international relations. And so it serves as a counter-argument to realism and balance of power theories, because it shows and provides an alternative course of action for states to take, rather than choosing the two, especially since balance of power strategies may be too bold of a move for a middle or small power such as South Africa. And thereafter, in assessing the two case studies, we find that it reveals ambiguities in South Africa's application of non-alignment. If we turn to the Russia-Ukraine war, it suggests or actions that South Africa took, particularly in 2023, points to an alignment with Russia rather than this adherence to non-alignment. And South Africa, for its part, did note that its refusal to blatantly criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine would have undermined its mediation efforts within that conflict. And then secondly, if we look at South Africa's foreign policy towards the Israel-Gaza war, we see the complete opposite. We see that South Africa is really embracing and is sincere in its application of non-alignment. And we find this in its decision to take Israel to the ICJ on the basis of genocidal acts. And beyond this, we also saw how it overcame traditional power blocks by being able to get support from both the global north and the global south in its cause to uphold international human rights and law. And so finally, we conclude the article by discussing some challenges that South Africa may face under the GNU with respect to its foreign policy. Just to note, and we mentioned in our article that the GNU statement of intent doesn't give much information on how we can reconcile these various foreign policy postures of the different GNU members. So currently it still falls under the purview of the ANC. Nevertheless, as I noted earlier, the difficulties and complexities that coalition governance brings to really arriving at a coherent foreign policy position. These different political parties may disagree. For example, the Democratic Alliance tends to favor more of a pro-Western stance, whereas we see with the ANC, it has historical ties to China and to Russia. So at times, these may be at loggerheads with each other. And this ultimately creates difficulty in consensus building, which is required within coalitional governance and politics. Also, these instances that we see in the media of public disagreements between members of the GNU regarding the ANC's foreign policy actions, it paints South Africa in a negative light, and it has the potential to undermine the state's credibility internationally, and it may be viewed by other international actors as being an unpredictable diplomatic partner to align with. And this has repercussions for trade. It has repercussions for investment. It can negatively affect investor confidence, which ultimately will have a negative impact on South Africa's economic trajectory. And then finally, there's also negative repercussions that may occur domestically for us as South Africans, those that are witnessing these public disagreements, these mixed signalings on the part of the GNU when it comes to foreign policy. It may detract our faith in our government to really get on the same page when it comes to these important issues of foreign policy. And this may be reflected later down the line when we go to vote at the polls. So in terms of a takeaway, I will conclude that it's quite possible that this principle of non-alignment will be a fixture in South African foreign policy for years to come. And so for this reason, it's important that policymakers, diplomats, those involved in foreign policy, think creatively in how it can be adapted and shifted away from something that's associated as an ANC ideology and used more as a diplomatic strategy to navigate a multipolar world order. And then we also conclude in our article that this principle of non-alignment could be a bridge, could serve as a bridge to bring together various political parties on the same page when it comes to foreign policy. However, I do feel that a non-aligned strategy will always necessitate an incremental approach to foreign policy making. calculations would have to be done on a case-by-case scenario based on international law and constitutional law. However, this underscores the importance, again, of having a clear line of communication among all key actors involved in foreign policy to avoid South Africa creating embarrassing diplomatic blunders, as we've seen now recently in the Simonstown case, the Wall for Peace exercise that happened in Simonstown. So ultimately, having a coherent foreign policy stance and a foreign policy in general is important, because the foreign policy of any state needs to reflect the state's national interest. And this interest is not an interest of any one political party. It's the collective interest of the nation as a whole that supersedes any specific group or sector. And ultimately, one of the key goals of foreign policy is that it should serve the interest of the average South African citizen, and they should experience directly the benefit of any gains we make internationally on the ground at home. So thank you for your attention, and Professor Otto and I welcome any questions or comments which you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nagar. That was an excellent overview, and I'm sure we will be getting questions, especially in view of some developments in the last few weeks, as you noted, with regard to the naval exercises that have been debated. I want to mention at this point, before handing over to Dr. Sithole, that there are other papers, and I will just mention, I've just seen the issue has been released as a whole on the TNF website. So you will see the articles in the order that they will appear in our print version. If you log on, I will share that link shortly. But I want to mention that we have two papers that actually focus specifically on the ICJ case. And they go into some detail, and it's a bit of two different perspectives. One is looking very much at, the one by Ivor Chipkin is looking very much at where domestic politics may have been the driver behind the decision to place that case. He asks, does South Africa's ICJ case against Israel resolve the organic crisis within the ANC? So that may be of interest in that discussion. But then on the other hand, we have a paper from a scholar in Indonesia who asks a question about South Africa's role in resolving the Gaza conflict through the lens of a legitimacy theory perspective. So does this very act by South Africa's government lend to its international legitimacy or not? And so that's another perspective on that set of questions that Marcel raised with Lisa in the article that she has just presented. There are other papers, but I would like now to turn to Dr. Sithole. I have introduced you. I see you are back with us, and I welcome your presentation of your paper, which is entitled South Africa's Role in Global Peace and Security, 30 Years of Conflict Resolution and a Post-2024 Foreign Policy Strategy. So, Tinashe, over to you.
All right, thank you so much for inviting me to this talk. So firstly, I just wanted to begin the scope of my presentation. So what I was trying to do essentially was to make sense of South Africa's foreign policy, I think, which in recent times has come under scrutiny, both internationally and locally. And I think, like has been mentioned, this scrutiny has more or less been around questions of consistency, and these concerns obviously are somewhat amplified, especially when South Africa engages with non-Western actors, power blocks. And I think in such a dominant Western foreign policy discourse, South Africa's engagements are often with non-traditional Western actors are frequently viewed as suspicious. So from my argument point of view is that I think that kind of critique often operates at face value, because I thought it assesses individual foreign policy positions in isolation without necessarily sufficiently giving attention to the broader structural environment in which decisions are made. So what this presentation is about, I'm not necessarily trying to defend any specific policy choices. It's just essentially trying to understand how we can interpret South Africa's foreign policy in the last 30 years, as well as post-2024, and essentially why these debates about consistency have intensified, and lastly, just try to also understand what are the structural and geopolitical pressures that have how they've shaped what is possible for South Africa. So I see that nuance is very important when we like to look at South African foreign policy, because South Africa is obviously operating in a world characterized by great power rivalry. And I think we'll say in the past 2 decades, we've seen a lot of crisis in terms of financial crisis, geopolitical crisis, health crisis. And I think this crisis have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. And I think we'd say at the same time, such economic integration has become powerful tools in a sense where we currently can, the current discourse around tariffs are being used as weapons, or financial infrastructure is used as cohesion. And I wanted to also point to the fact that there's an idea of the two-track diplomacy that is very important, and that South Africa, we've seen that it often combines public principal positions in terms of multilateral platforms and engages in quieter engagement behind the scenes. And I think when this dynamic is often overlooked, I think strategic behavior is more often easily misread or misread as inconsistency. So really, it's just not necessarily to criticize or justify South Africa positions, but my position was trying to understand it structurally so that we can also then be able to reflect the kind of foreign policy that can be sustainable in the current global condition. So obviously, understanding that at 30 years passage of time, I think, as noted already, we are able to identify different patterns as well as continuity in terms of South African foreign policy, and we do see some form of consistency in terms of features that we see in terms of peace building, as well as conflict resolution in terms of its pillars, in terms of external engagement. And we have noted how South Africa has been able to propagate dialogue, mediation, negotiated solutions, aspects that are touched in part of the special issues in the different case studies. And we've noted that also South Africa, rather than relying on coercive power, South Africa has been able to use multilateralism as a key strategy. And I think this approach, it reflects both normative commitments of South Africa in terms of its foreign policy and the practical constraints that are often associated with a middle power such as South Africa that relies on engagement on these multilateral platforms. And I think this orientation of South Africa over the past 30 years has not really changed in terms of the emphasis of most of the administration in terms of this foreign policy inclination. But I think at the same time, this degree of continuity is very important to emphasize. And I think the significance of this period in terms of 30 years and onwards, I think it lies not necessarily in terms of the unbroken record, but I think in recognizing that what South Africa has done in terms of engaging in terms of foreign policy and now has to be sustained in a far more complex and demanding global condition. So this is the context on where I try making my argument. And I think if we take this a longer view of South Africa's foreign policy or orientation, we have noted that South Africa is very much internationalized, and it's highly visible in terms of its global and continental politics. And I think this visibility it's what also has led to South Africa being frequently expected to speak, to mediate, to take positions on major international issues. And this positions obviously has had many consequences in the context of the current global climate that South Africa finds itself in, and they tend to attract scrutiny. I think I'll say both home and abroad, but we can see that this dynamic is clearly in contemporary issues, really, where South Africa have attracted scrutiny in terms of how it engaged in Ukraine mediation, vis-a-vis non-alignment, the ICJ cases that are dealt in depth in terms of other special issue. And I think in this case, they've generated strong conditions, not because of South Africa's coercive power, but in terms of what South Africa is perceived to represent. And I think this heightened visibility and expectation help explain why these debates about consistency have become very much relevant, as well as so prominent. So three things. I mean, the context is I think has been laid out. You understand that there's been three shifts, the way I identify them, in terms of the pressures, in terms of the domestic changes within South Africa post 2024. In terms of trying to understand, how different political actors within the government have different diverging political views, which has implications within its government in terms of making foreign policy. And I think this has been made apparent in terms of reactions, in terms of the military action in Venezuela, in terms of how other political actors within the government feel. And I think the second pressure, of course, is the global power rivalry, where trade has increasingly become a tool for leverage as South Africa finds itself as it engaging in its foreign policy. And I think it signals alignment and, the foreign policy where somewhat transactional diplomacy and rewarding of compliance under this geopolitical pressure that South Africa finds itself in. And I would say this is very important. It's a very important point because it directly affects South Africa as well as other middle powers in terms of the diplomatic space they find themselves in. And then the last point would then be the rule-based order that is essentially that is fading and to some degree has weakened in terms of how middle powers largely rely on an engagement in terms of multilateral platforms, which have their power somewhat dwindling in this case. And you see South Africa has then heavily relied on this multilateralism, even it's a response to the Venezuela situation, how it relies on international law to amplify its voice. So taken together, I would say that this creates a context in terms of this long-standing foreign policy orientation for South Africa. And I would then argue that it's operating under a far greater strain. And moving forward, just to also engage in the consistency debate, I think it's not surprising that South African foreign policy has increasingly become a subject of debate. But I also think that if we have to treat consistency as something that can be assessed on comparison alone, I think there is lack of insufficient attention to the broader structural environment in terms of this foreign policy decisions. And I think this is precisely how I view that there's a limitation in terms of how it's framed, and then my analytical departure shift to how then I reframe the question and frame my contribution in terms of the article. So in terms of framing the question, I think it becomes important then to try to understand that consistent debates, framing case by case terms of South Africa's foreign policy has engaged in different cases in the ICJ and DRC, perhaps in Zimbabwe and other within the region. Really, I think we need to assess this foreign policy within the broader forces that shape the decision in the first place, because it is within this context which is what shapes what's possible for a country like South Africa in terms of how it reacts. So what are those forces which interlink in terms of its domestic forces as well as these external forces, and how do they impact in terms of foreign policy decisions that South Africa has to make? So it means now we have to ask questions in terms of how then this foreign policy is shaped from these forces, and rather than isolated preferences or intentions where South Africa seem to behave in a way that favors others. Maybe it's found to be within the wrong group, or South Africa is inclined to the wrong friends. I've seen such observations being made. A lot of people want to understand what is this foreign policy that South Africa is following in terms of within that regard. So again, moving forward to the next slide. So from this perspective, I then try to understand that this approach then, it becomes helpful then to understand what is then my contribution to the study. So I use a liberal institutionalist theory, and in the same light, I equally use scenario planning, somewhat to understand what has been the factors that have influenced South Africa's foreign policy and the interaction of these variables, and what is it that we are able to, as an analytical tool, how are we able to understand the decisions that are made within South Africa? What are the different considerations that the government makes in this as it propagates its foreign policy? So the approach is helpful because if you look at the neoliberal, so liberal institutionalism, it talks about how South Africa is hugely dependent on multilateral institutions and how these institutions have shaped behavior and constrained choices, as well as commitments over time, how South Africa is able to express itself on these platforms. And on scenario analysis, the whole point was trying to understand what is the plausible foreign policy trajectory based on South Africa's experiences and the context it finds itself, and in order to make sense on why South Africa is acting the way it acts, so that people don't think it's inconsistency to an extent. So the first variable, it was two independent variables. The one was the commitment to values, how South Africa commits to its human rights and democracy, multilateralism, international law. And it's very important because this commitment is most visible in how South Africa's preference in multilateralism and its reliance on international legal processes. And the second variable is in this case, external political pressure, geopolitical pressure. So particularly then, South Africa's actions, perhaps with the United States, there is political leverage perhaps the US can try to use in order to arm twist South Africa to act in a specific way. So this is the context of what are the major powers, as well as regional pressures that would influence South Africa to act in a particular way. So this is the context, and these variables are on a spectrum. So essentially then it comes to say the interaction of these variables, it gives us 4 scenarios. And these four scenarios are analytical tools that help us to think about the plausible trajectories under the combination of this interaction to understand South Africa right now. What is it, the current foreign policy scenario that we have? So it's 4 foreign policy scenarios that come about. And the most important one would then be idealism under strain, which is what I then argue that this is where South Africa finds itself. And the different empirical indicators to show how this is playing out and how this has played out in terms of when we want to analyze this in terms of the ICJ case, where the United States is having a gripe with South Africa with regards to how it brought the ICJ case, the Gaza case to the ICJ. And secondly, equally also trying to understand the non-alignment. That non-alignment itself, as a position, it reflects, it's a position exercised under sustained pressure from the West. So it is within these variables where there's strong geopolitical pressure, as well as strong inclination by South Africa to be aligned to its foreign policy, where this interaction will give us the scenario that is idealism under strain. So just before I conclude, I just wanted to then highlight my key contributions. So my first key contribution then is that rather than moving, it's about moving the analysis beyond a moral judgment and essentially be able to explain South Africa's foreign policy from a structural explanation to say, this is why, perhaps this is why it's acting in a certain way. These are the different factors at play. Because much of the debate, I think it somewhat has tried to evaluate in terms of the current configuration within the current government to say, why does our government seem to want to be friends with the wrong people? That is the language and framing in terms of specific cases. So what the article tries to do then is to instead ask why certain choices emerge under particular conditions, so that we're able then to say, when we're judging South Africa, this framework is able then to position how its positions are shaped by these pressures, middle power constraints, institutional commitments. And the second contribution is that the article operates in terms of non-alignment is not treated as passivity or indecision, because I think that is what it, in some way, it might be framed. It's an active strategy that is in a highly polarized system. So South Africa finds itself in this contested different pressures that it has to balance. So it becomes a balancing act in as much as South Africa has to balance its national interest. So without this balancing act, its national interest might end up being undermined. So it's the balance of the forces where this framework then tries to come down to in understanding the foreign policy. And so it's this scenario framework then is a forward-looking analytical tool in order to just understand as a scholar or policymaker in terms of understanding how future decisions, without defaulting really in terms of maybe the foreign policy is inconsistent, or it has abandoned its values, or South Africa is drifting away from its values. And essentially then this is the balancing act under strain, where it comes down to what is the current foreign policy trajectory where South Africa finds itself in, and what are the forces included. I think I will end here. And yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll end here and invite any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tinashe. That was a good overview, and I have also posted a link to a related paper that looks specifically at the Africa Peace Mission, which I know you also discussed in your article, the one for Ukraine and Russia in 2023, and South Africa's attempts there at mediation and conflict resolution. I think at this point we do have a few questions, and we can begin to turn the floor back over to the various panelists. I would like to ask if anybody has a specific question for a specific panelist, if they would note it in when they post the question. I think, Lisa, let's start with the question on multilateralism.
Great. So I think just for the benefit...
Would you read the question?
Yes, I was going to read the question. Okay, so do you think multilateralism is getting weaker, or superpowers like the US are deliberately undermining the world system to achieve their interests? I would say that there's obviously strong evidence that multilateralism is under stress, but I don't necessarily think we can point to credible proof that any particular actor, including the United States, is deliberately undermining the world system as a particular strategy to achieve its interests. So I think there's a combination of kind of structural shifts in global power, changing strategic priorities of major states, and institutional limitations that have weakened multilateral cooperation. And certainly behavior by states like the United States have contributed to undermining that. And I think we've seen that quite clear juxtaposition between the Western response in Ukraine and the Western response in Gaza, as showing up those kind of inconsistencies in terms of the application of the so-called rules of the game. Obviously, there's a lot of commentary at the moment about whether the liberal world order is dead, whether NATO is dead, whether the UN is dying. And I think those are all particularly important questions, because we see that these institutions and that these kind of rules the international system post the World Wars, they do face, they're under significant pressure, facing significant challenges. And multilateral institutions, I think, are often seen as being less effective at resolving disputes or acting decisively. The veto power would be one reason, for example, for that in the United Nations Security Council. So I think, we're having declining unipolarity, whether states like that or not, from US dominance towards a more kind of multipolar architecture where many states are having increasing or kind of varying types of influence. And also because we're seeing interests diverge more sharply, particularly with the brand of foreign policy that is being espoused from the United States at the moment. And so I think it's important also to note that multiple states influence the dynamics of multilateralism. It's not just the United States. We see this, for example, in the United States' reaction, at G20 with South Africa handing over to them, and the response that we saw from other countries with the quite kind of abrasive comments that had come from Donald Trump around South Africa at that time. So I think we also see China, Russia, and other states that are kind of reshaping norms, and emerging groups like BRICS that are putting forward an alternative vision. So it's under strain, but I don't know that it's necessarily a particular strategy to serve particular interests. I think the United States will find after the presidency of Donald Trump ends that their foreign policy has left them worse off rather than better off. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. There are other questions coming through. We will attempt to address those. Some of them are statements. I would like to encourage people, if they want to pose a question, a specific question, this does help us to address the concerns expressed. Dr. Nagar, are you happy to address the question regarding the allegations by Donald Trump and how this is about South Africa's domestic politics and how this affects South Africa's foreign policy? You might want to draw that line.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridgman. So the question from one of the participants is, how will South Africa stop false allegations that are being spread by the Trump administration, which state that Black Africans are killing Afrikaners? And just to respond to this quite briefly, it's impossible to physically stop the administration from spreading these allegations. But I think we can be quite satisfied with ourselves as a country, given that South Africa does have a good international reputation as a norm entrepreneur. It has a high degree of soft power and influence. It did emerge once it transitioned to democracy as this defender of human rights, which has allowed it to navigate the international system over the past 3 decades. So that would very much counter any false claims that are being spread currently by the Trump administration. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcel. I am not sure if Tinashe has seen the request that he address one of the questions from Leslie Masters, so I'm going to give him a moment there. Okay. To read that question, and I believe you can, unless you're ready to answer that question already. Tinashe, would you like a moment?
Let me just give it a try. Yes, okay. So I think in practice, South Africa...
Can you read the question, please?
Where is it? It says, okay, so the question is, when is South Africa's foreign policy leaning on the principle of non-alignment, and when is this leaning on solidarity? How do the two link and differ? How does the introduction of the idea of active non-alignment shape foreign policy going forward? Thank you. All right. Okay. So I think in practice, I think South Africa leans on non-alignment. I think when the priority is more or less in preserving strategic autonomy. I think a good example is response to Ukraine. I think it avoided formally siding with either Western powers or Russia. I think it emphasized dialogue in that sense and some mediation. I think there was instance of the aim was not to be morally neutral, but it was somewhat engaging in terms of giving space across the divide. And I think it ends more in terms of solidarity, especially when you take positions that are grounded in historical experiences or a normative commitment. So maybe the Israel case in the ICJ reflects that because it somewhat draws more to international law and South Africa's own anti-apartheid legacy. And these acts are understood basically as South Africa's normative commitments based on its foreign policy. Yeah, I would say they're two linked. I think they are linked, but not necessarily the same. Because I would say non-alignment is not. It does not formally. Is about who South Africa does not formally align with. So I would say the BRICS, for instance, so in that sense, that's where non-alignment, while solidarity, it's more about standing on principle. Yeah, I'm trying to think how to best put that in terms of where is non-alignment and where is solidarity. And I think tensions arise when solidarity is interpreted externally as a geopolitical alignment. And you find this especially with the issue of ICJ, where the US ambassador, one of his key roles is perhaps for South Africa to drop its ICJ case. I think if I remember that correctly. The idea of active alignment, active non-alignment. I think active non-alignment, I think it might, in any case, look at non-alignment as engagement rather than withdrawal, where South Africa will somewhat take principled positions, but often maybe through legal channels or something of that sort, because that would also make it also not be able to resist great powers in terms of which camp does it fall on. So perhaps in that sense, it tries to take a principled position based on multilateral channels. I think South Africa is very good at that, and this is, I think, this is a reality of most middle powers. They find themselves in that corner where they have to there's constraint rather than them having to actually abandon their values. Yeah, I think that is how I see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tinashe. I am aware that several questions are coming through. There's quite a lot of overlap between some of them. I'm going to ask Dr. Marcel Nagar to address questions about the Russia, South Africa's policy on Russia. There are two questions there. One from Marcel, do you see them? Did you see my? Yes. Okay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bridgman. So just to respond to its comment made by Richard Stevenson, he says that South Africa's foreign policy language shows a selective bias. It invokes international law loudly when Western powers violate sovereignty, yet retreats into non-alignment and procedural vagueness when Russia commits comparable or worse aggression. The result is not principled neutrality, but an asymmetrical moral standard. So I think that really sums up quite nicely. It's a good take on it, and we explain it a bit within our article, South Africa's unique interpretation of non-alignment and how it relates to its relationship with Russia. So when South Africa was conceptualizing it in 1979 at the Havana Summit, it defined it as being both non-alignment as being both anti-imperialist and anti-Western, which in turn interpreted as rendering the Soviet Union as a natural partner, which it did partner with and it did support it during its anti-apartheid struggle. So to a certain extent, that does explain this rather ambiguous relationship that South Africa has with Russia, if we look back at the history. And then there was a similar question raised by Klaus on the same matter. So that just speaks to it that it does have this historical relationship and it does conceive as of non-alignment, at least back then, as being anti-imperialist and anti-Western. And so for that reason, it is leaning towards a closer tie with the Soviet Union back then and Russia today. Thank you.
I would like to also address the question from Klaus Kotte regarding whether strategic communication failures were part of the picture. He asks, is it not simply that South Africa communicated its position poorly vis-a-vis non-alignment on the Russia-Ukraine matter, showing the dominance and blurred lines between the ANC, which is pro-Russia, in government, and the government, which is not pro-Russian but non-aligned? Is this not a failure of strategic communications? Lisa, do you want to perhaps, he did say this is for both speakers.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in our paper we do touch on that. So this idea, and I think, you know, I've thought about this a lot also in relation to the bilateral relationship between South Africa and the United States, is that what we say is not always what's being heard. And so I agree with you then in that sense of strategic communication. I think we could oftentimes deliver the same actions but slightly differently. So we need to be packaging it differently so that what we are doing is not being seen as necessarily holding court with pariahs or less favorable actors from the Western point of view, but that it is really pointing to this kind of notion of active non-alignment where the decision to not align is a strategic choice that enables us to hedge. And so I think I certainly agree with you that, you know, that's not coming across clearly. And so, you know, as I think they'd probably say in communication studies, that communication is not just what you say, but it's also about what's being heard. And so if the recipient doesn't hear what you intended them to hear, then you have to go back to the drawing board and say, well, you know, how do I say it in a way, how do I communicate it in a way that message is actually being heard? And so I would concur from that point of view.
Thank you. That's helpful. I see some questions regarding the rules-based order, what it would look like if shaped by a global South coalition rather than by established powers, a sort of post-Trump 2.0 world. I think this hinges very much on the questions about multilateralism, but also harkens back to the BRICS special issue that we published also mid last year, right around the time of the Brazil BRICS summit. So I would like to refer Zimkita Manana to those papers, but if any of the panelists believe they would like to address that question. Also, Lisa, I know that you were happy to discuss the Trump approach to South Africa and what's going on with regard to those allegations. I didn't mean to dismiss that offer.
Sure, I can try and package all of those together in an answer. So there was a question about South Africa not being invited to Trump's proposed board of peace. And do you think this aims to nullify the UN Security Council? And then there's a question about Trump's threats against NATO, highlighting his contribution to it and demanding more of a diplomatic alliance and the potential threats that this poses for small states, and then linked to Zimkhita's question around rules-based order. So on the first point, I think we know that Trump's foreign policy is transactional, and it is, I'm sorry to say it, egotistical. So he is a man who seems to need to have his ego stroked quite a lot and quite often. And I think we've seen that also illustrated with his speech at the World Economic Forum, where a lot of people are saying it comes back to this kind of taco, Trump always chickens out, right? Is that he tries to push the envelope so far. He tries to utilize the carrot and the stick in quite a brash kind of way. And so we know that Trump doesn't like us. And so we know that you know, we're not the flavor of the month in Washington. And so are we surprised that we've not been invited to the club in Gaza? No, I don't think it's surprising at all. I think it's reflective of you know, Trump's foreign policy. I would also say about the Board of Peace that it's been roundly criticized by Europe. Many states that have been invited are rejecting that invitation, exactly because they feel that it would kind of bypass the UN system. So I don't know what Trump's intentions are, but I would say that he obviously has his particular idea of his contributions to peacemaking and so on, and that the Board of Peace reflects those kinds of ideas. With NATO, I think, you know, we're glad to see that he's backed down from his threats on Greenland. Certainly, it would have put NATO in an unenviable and unthinkable position for one member of the alliance to launch a military attack against another, and then to have the rest of the alliance kind of fight back against the other ally. So I think this is just another one of those kinds of indicators that point to concerns around the existing kind of structure of the international system, the existing security arrangements, the existing multilateral fora. And I think it's something that states like South Africa and others within the global south, such as those within BRICS, have been highlighting this kind of system that theoretically is based on these values, right? But that ultimately is kind of Orwellian in this notion that, you know, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, right? And so then just to ponder on Zimkhita's question, if we had a rules-based order that was conceived by the Global South, what might this look like? And of course, this is a kind of nice blue skies kind of question rather than an empirical one. But I would imagine that in a Global South-shaped order, legitimacy would come more from concepts like universal consent, of actual equal legal standing of states, and of consistency in application, because I think those, you know, under those kinds of categories that we've seen a lot of kind of dissatisfaction emerging from the Global South. If we're assuming within this system that the UN is actually up for reform, then I think we would see a reformed UN and one that had a Security Council or whatever body replaced a Security Council that wasn't basically entrenching the power of a handful of states. So I think it would be the primary organization, but it would be reformed. And I think that we'd probably see that distinguishing between law and norms being an element that would potentially reshape such a system. But that is just some conjecture on my part.
Okay, thank you. I have just seen a question from Aditi Labahadur in the chat box. I would like to ask Dr. Nagar and Dr. Otto to look at that, but and consider how to answer. She says it's to both of you. But in the meantime, to Tinashe, there is a question about the African Peace Mission, and I believe from Isabel Bosman-Burnett in the Q&A box. So let me just read it, and Tinashe, see if you feel like you might like to answer. The article on the African Peace Mission to Kiev and Moscow mentions the fact that the initiative has essentially been forgotten about, but that it signaled Africa's drive to play a more assertive role on the global stage. Do you think the ongoing war in Ukraine is an issue that Africa should use to continue asserting itself? Are there more international affairs issues that Africa should also be addressing? I mean, we might mention, you mentioned the DRC in your paper and also Sudan, I believe. So perhaps you could respond to that question.
All right. I hope I understand the question, but I'll say on the Ukraine, the peace mission, I think it mattered less because it ended the war and more because it signaled intent. I think it showed that to some extent that how Africa feels does not see itself as a rule taker or bystander to an extent. And I think Ukraine is an issue Africa can continue to engage on, but not as a mediator trying to compete with great powers. But I think rather Africa's values would rely in terms of consistently pushing for a dialogue, restraint, and protection of civilians. I think that's where the value is, and at the same time, I think they can in this case they can highlight how these global conflicts undermine things such as food security. I think that was the biggest issue relevant in terms of that Ukraine war. And I think more broadly, we should not necessarily focus. Africa shouldn't focus on Africa on Ukraine alone. I think there's international issues where they're both necessary. If you think about the Gaza and the reforms in terms of the UN Security Council, so I think the key point for me would that be Africa's assertiveness should not be tied to one war, one theater. I think it should be about consistent engagement on issues that shape or affect African society, and using these platforms to amplify voices rather than acting alone. So more or less on that multilateral diplomacy. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I think you have. Please feel free, the other panelists, if you have thoughts on that matter, but maybe we can turn first to the question from Aditi about the middle powers. She mentions Carney and the Canadian Prime Minister's address. There is another question that also from an anonymous attendee about the Canadian Prime Minister's speech at Davos this week. And is that really a call on mid-sized countries to band together? There's a lot of overlap there. So perhaps you can, I don't know, Lisa or Marcel, you can choose who would like to start.
I'll go first if that's okay.
Go ahead, Marcel.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Dr. Bridgman. I think this call that the Canadian Prime Minister has made is quite a provocative one, and it kind of reminds me of the story of Gulliver's Travels, where the tiny Lilliputs band together to take down the giant. So it seems to be this call for smaller middle powers to band together against larger powers within the international system. But I think the point that this participant made in the webinar chat box is quite important. When you form this alliance that transcends countries from the global north, it includes countries from the global south, we need to take into consideration the sizes of these middle powers. Are they all the same? Are they all on the same footing? Will they all benefit equally from such an alliance? And would it be in South Africa's interest for them to join such an alliance should it take place, or should it rather just carry on with its more flexible non-alignment approach to its foreign policy?
Okay, thank you. Dr. Otto?
Yes, thanks Aditi for the question. I think, I've seen some quite interesting and positive responses coming from Africa around Kani, and I think you might have posted on LinkedIn earlier today to that effect as well. And I think what's striking to me is that, they're operating from kind of different places or different points of view, right? So I think there's different strategic purpose in terms of Western middle powers versus middle powers from the global South. So I think Western middle powers are largely responding to a loss of insulation in terms of diminishing American guarantees, vulnerability in the supply chain that we see is quite a kind of hot potato political topic. And then, of course, there's heightened tensions between both great powers, but also just generally within the transatlantic relationship. So I see this kind of repositioning as being defensive and self-regarding, whereas I think for African middle powers, they're coming from a different kind of history, which is more the anti-colonial struggle, the racialized global hierarchy that perpetuates structural inequalities, and then the structural dependency that's built into the international order. So I think for them, it's more about surviving within the system with dignity. And so I think whereas you might see a Western, and obviously I'm speaking broad strokes here, but Western middle powers can be seen maybe more as system stabilizers, I think we see African middle powers and maybe even some global South middle powers as being system challengers. So the Western ones are kind of shoring up the weakening order, but the African ones are maybe trying to redefine what stability within that order means, or maybe even what the order itself looks like. So yeah, just a reflection there.
Thank you. We are drawing near to the end of our time. There is a very, as usually, provocative comment from Peter Vale. Thank you, Peter, if you're still with us. I did want to note that interesting question he poses about what has happened to the idea of Ubuntu foreign policy. Now, in one sense, that often has been referred, the Africa focus within South Africa's foreign policy, and that embrace of other developing nations' goals that we share in South Africa. But I wonder how this relates to the idea of non-alignment in a volatile world. None of the papers specifically addressed that, although it did harken back. The first article by Susie Graham et al. Gives a good overview of South Africa's foreign policy since '94, including that of Nelson Mandela, where that idea was posed. As Steve Grudes points out, that article in Foreign Policy was co-authored, to say the least. And so I wonder if any of our panelists would like to comment, or if there is a conversation to be had about that, we could pick that up in further discussions following the chat, or in the chat box itself. But I'm happy for any of the panelists if they would like to look at that question of what has happened to the idea of Ubuntu foreign policy. Anyone?
I can have a go, Martha.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, we've seen Ubuntu foreign policy, obviously where we're looking at relational ethics, human dignity, reconciliation, mediation, and so on. I think we've seen that in policy expression, maybe in conflict mediation in places like Burundi and the DRC, in a focus on African consensus building through the African Union, a kind of focus maybe on reintegration of post-conflict states rather than necessarily wanting to isolate them, and in the focus on multilateralism over kind of unilateral action. So I think it's kind of functioned as a disciplining ethic, so kind of constraining power rather than amplifying it. But I think it's also come under structural pressure. So I think the securitization of foreign policy, where we've seen South Africa, like many states, shift over time towards economic diplomacy, trade and investment, security cooperation, energy, and geopolitical calculations, where I think we've these pressures have kind of seen measurable interests be put over those kind of relational ethics. I think the international system has also become harsher in a way because it's become more polarized, driven recently certainly by sanctions and definitely more militarized. And then I think we've had our own domestic constraints in terms of our economic crisis, poverty and inequality and unemployment, which have impacted, I think, the also domestic views towards certain people in other places in the world. And so I think that ethic, it's been retained as language, but weakened in practice. I think we've seen it being hollowed out. We see it reflected in speeches or maybe in white papers. So it's there in the symbolism. But I think that it's less often used to justify. And I think it's been overridden in certain cases. So yeah, I think there's a contradiction there. Again, I think the earlier points in the conversation about consistency in terms of how South Africa presents itself on paper, but then also in practice.
Thank you. I think that does help with understanding where Ubuntu is now. I think that we have some very interesting further comments, but we need to draw to a close. I would like to encourage people to read the further messages that were posted at the end of the chat. Keenan Naidu, Richard Stevenson, Zimkita Manyana. I apologize, we can't answer all those questions. It's been a productive and fruitful, I think, session. There's obviously much more to discuss. And I think that right now, with what is going on in the geopolitical environment in which South Africa finds itself, there will be more surprises ahead. Hopefully, some of these papers or all of these papers would give us some tools to navigate and understand the foreign policy postures that we see coming out of Pretoria. I would like to thank a few people and also to point all the attendees to the evaluation form that was posted in the chat box earlier by our events team. I do thank you, Sarasa, and also Ndumi, for your part in the technical side of keeping the Zoom meeting, organizing it and then keeping it going, and also to Melissa for the communications side of things. We appreciate that support. And thank you to Lisa, to Dr. Lisa Otto, Dr. Marcel Nagar for your role in the guest editing the issue and working through the various paper submissions and then drawing it all together. And thank you, Tinashe, you're the sole sort of representative of the other authors. Thank you for your part and for persevering through the PR and revisions process. I will say that to all the authors who might be logged on. We appreciate the contributions of everyone involved. So with that, I'm going to call it to a close right at 4 o'clock and invite you please to view that evaluation. It does help us know what we can improve in terms of SAIIA events. Thanks, everyone.